Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm glad to be here and also glad to be going last, as my topic really falls at the intersection of the two previous topics. It shows how the Islamophobia industry has responded to Sharia in the court system. The result has been, as we've discussed a little bit, a wave of so-called anti-Sharia legislation. This is legislation, proposed bills, or state constitutional amendments that are ostensibly designed to keep Sharia, sometimes combined with other religious or cultural legal systems, sometimes combined with foreign or international law, out of the U.S. courts. As I will discuss, however, such legislation is at best unnecessary and misguided. At worst, it's part of a concerted effort to vilify Muslims, albeit indirectly, by setting up Sharia as a kind of straw man to be attacked instead. So during the time I have, I'm going to talk about how broad this anti-Sharia movement is and how it has progressed, giving you examples of actual legislation and discussing its legal and practical impacts. Okay. How do I go to the next slide? Enter? Okay, I got it. All right. This map is a little bit out of date. Everyone's been saying about 24. I believe the latest count is somewhere around 70 bills or amendments introduced in over 30 states, and that's in the past 2 years or so. To date, such legislation has passed in 6 states, but it's been tried again and again in many other states. In Georgia, which is where I live, for example, it's been tried 4 times, 3 bills and 1 state constitutional amendment. While the tactics have evolved somewhat, the push has not really abated at all. All of these pieces of legislation are designed to target Sharia, although they don't always do so explicitly. Okay, well, enter. Okay, here we have the word for Sharia in Arabic, and I think this is the 3rd transliteration of Sharia that you've been treated to today, and it's my preferred one because it's the simplest. It's, Sharia, like Maria. I just met a law named Sharia, okay? So, without going into it, again, in great detail, it's a methodology, and as a lawyer, I like to compare it to other legal systems that are used in the world. For example, there is the system in the United States and the UK and other places is called common law. Other places use civil law, which is a system that originated in continental Europe. But Sharia, as in these other systems, is a system that actual application and law varies tremendously from place to place. So, for example, both the US and Canada use a common law system, but there are still differences between the laws and the whole legal system. And that doesn't make one wrong and the other one right, they're just different. Similarly, in the United States, we don't have just American law, each state has its own law. So there's Illinois law and New York law, and one is not more correct than the other, they're just different. So Sharia, as it's interpreted in, say, Saudi Arabia, will be vastly different from that in Egypt or Malaysia. There are different schools of Islamic law, even within the same country often, and no one of these Sharias is necessarily better or more correct than the other. They are just different. There is a different Sharia for each person when you get right down to it, as Professor McFarland said. I keep doing that, sorry. Unlike common law or civil law, however, Sharia is often said by both proponents and opponents to be all-encompassing. What that basically means is that it includes acts or behaviors that are not typically considered to be legal in character. This is very similar to Jewish law, which also includes moral precepts and ritual observances. It's really important to note that the degree of Sharia observance varies greatly among Muslims in the United States, just as it does among Muslims in the rest of the world. Some are very observant, others will be very happy to sit down and have a beer with you. Such a pattern is similar to adherents of other religions in the U.S. who make their own personal decisions on how observant they want to be. So in a U.S. context, we see Sharia on different levels. First is the moral and ritual level. So being honest, praying, giving to charity, eating halal food. It also appears in the context of family relationships. We talked about questions of marriage and divorce, inheritance, and increasingly it can be seen in business or commercial dealings. You have a growing market in Sharia-compliant financing, and sometimes mediation and arbitration based on Sharia principles. So in most cases, Sharia practices are very private, but they can appear in court. Now, as we discussed, it can appear two ways: as foreign law, and this is no different than foreign law coming in from France or Japan or Great Britain. It can also come in purely domestic cases, religious freedom cases, divorce, arbitration. This is no different than Jews or Seventh-day Adventists or other religious groups. So, but as we've seen, courts will not enforce Sharia in either of these contexts if doing so would violate an individual's rights under the Constitution or violate a forum's public policy. So, as we've talked about, courts will reject child custody decrees coming from a Muslim-majority country if they find that it doesn't suit the public policy. Public policy in the United States requires that you consider the best interests of the child. If you use a Sharia determination, which is based primarily on the age and sex of a child, U.S. courts will not enforce it because they feel that this is not in the best interests of a child. So why the concern? Well, creeping Sharia, of course, which is part of the stealth jihad, which is rather histrionically, in my opinion, seen as a threat to our nation and our way of life. So let's look at the different types of anti-Sharia legislation. Okay. As I mentioned, these are bills or law or proposed state constitutional amendments, and they come in two main flavors. Okay. Now, what we're going to call the plain vanilla variety are facially neutral. That is, the language of the bill or amendment is neutral on its face. It does not explicitly name Sharia and may make no mention of religion or culture at all. The other one is Sharia specific. We're going to call this chocolate for comparison purposes. These explicitly name Sharia, either alone or along with other religious or cultural legal systems. So let's look first at legislation that explicitly names Sharia, because these were prevalent in the first wave of legislation that attacked Sharia. Okay. So we talked about this amendment, the Oklahoma Save Our State Amendment. In November of 2010, 70% of voters in Oklahoma voted for this, and it really brought the whole anti-Sharia legislation movement into the limelight. The purpose of the amendment was to prohibit state courts from looking to the legal precepts of other nations or cultures and explicitly specified international law, which includes treaties, and Sharia law. And then it went even further, prohibiting courts in Oklahoma from considering the law of another state if that state's law included Sharia law. It's not really clear what this meant or how it would have been applied. But this law never went into effect. We never had a chance to see that. Like a doctor will tell you, chocolate ice cream is really bad for you. It's got all that fat and sugar, and so this has all that unconstitutional stuff, First Amendment violations and things like that. So the judge, like a doctor said, this is bad for us. We can't have it. It violates the First Amendment of the Constitution. And it was the Federal District Court in Oklahoma issued a preliminary injunction, and that was upheld by the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. It was held up on First Amendment grounds, but in fact there are a whole number of constitutional grounds on which it could have been challenged. Those were just never raised or addressed. In 2011, Arizona tried to avoid potential problems that could arise by singling out Sharia by including it as one of a number of different religious legal systems. So this isn't just the plain chocolate, this has got chocolate chips and fudge mixed in with it. Okay? So it goes on to name not just Sharia, but other religious sectarian law, which it helpfully defines as including canon law, halakha, which is Jewish law, and karma. Now, it's outside my area of expertise, but I'm not sure you can bar the law of karma from a courtroom. This bill also sought to ban the use of foreign law by Arizona courts. This is done quite frequently, as we will see, and it's not just a backdoor attack on Sharia, but it's because proponents of such legislation are generally also suspicious of what they deem to be foreign influences on U.S. law, including international legal norms. So, even though this bill did not single out Sharia, it still likely would have been unconstitutional because it addressed religious law in general. We've also mentioned this law from Tennessee, which is slightly different than the other two. It did not look to bar courts from using Sharia. Rather, it was allegedly written to outlaw the support of terrorism and threaten penalties of up to 15 years in prison. As it was first introduced, however, it specifically linked terrorism to Sharia observance and defined Sharia in a phrase that was lifted directly from a Center for Security Policy report called Sharia, the Threat to America. This is Frank Gaffney and David Yerushalmi, who was mentioned before. And it said it is a legal, political, military, doctrinal system, and inserted, the knowing adherence to Sharia is prima facie evidence of an act in support of the overthrow of the United States government and the government of this state, and goes on to define a Sharia organization as two or more persons conspiring to support Sharia, which pretty much makes it sound like if you're serving halal food at a dinner party, it's tantamount to you and your guests trying to overthrow the U.S. government. Not until pages later in the bill is it made clear what's really outlawed. Okay? It's Sharia organizations that engage or intend to engage in terrorism, and only material support of such a terrorist attempt is a felony punishable by 15 years in prison. So this law is basically a sundae. You've got your specific mention of Sharia as your chocolate ice cream, but then there's all this unnecessary language about legal, political, military, doctrinal systems and prima facie evidence of overthrowing the government, which is basically lots and lots of whipped cream and sprinkles and a few nuts on the top there.